of silence. Mr. Jasinski, Commissioner Jasinski. Your mic is off, sir.
There you go. Yes, sir.
Commissioner Stevens,
Here.
Commissioner Bauer. Well, we still haven't got Commissioner Bauer. Sorry about that, but we're going to move on anyway. Commissioner Persinger.
Here.
Audit Committee Chair, Mrs. Johnson.
I'm here. And I have two of my committee members are on as well. Bernie Krause and Donna Alexander.
Say that again.
Bernie Krause and Donna Alexander are also here.
Thank you very much for doing that. That helps out. Budget and Finance Committee Chair, Dave Davis.
I'm present, and also Phil Winkler and Joe Keenly from the Budget and Finance Committee.
Investment.
Venture.
Say what?
Oh, no, I'm not on that. Yeah, I am the investment committee. I'm sorry.
Investment Committee Chair, Brian Prever.
I am here.
And I believe Mr. Trencher is with your committee. And
He is.
Correct.
I was looking through the gallery now to see who's.
Anybody else from that committee?
Yeah, me. Whoops.
Oh, okay. And I see Commissioner Bauer has joined us.
Hello,
How are you, sir?
I'm good, and you?
Good, thank you. And we're doing a roll call here, a quick one. And Town Manager Bill Zolper and Town Clerk Ashley Sander. I believe we got everybody formally on the roll. If we could just stand for a moment and say the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance
Allegiance
to the flag
of the United States of America.
United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you.
Dale, we also have Sheena with us. I don't think you mentioned her.
That's correct. I apologize, Sheena. We have our town finance clerk here, Sheena Gossett. We'll have to have a moment of silence for all our service members throughout the world that are out there protecting us. One moment of silence, please. Thank you very much. I'll take a motion to accept the agenda as printed,
So moved.
properly moved. Who's the second?
I'll second.
Second by Mr. Persinger, moved by Mr. Winkler. All in favor, say aye.
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 Any nays? Any abstentions? We'll take that as unanimous. Ashley, do we have anybody on the public comment section that would like to comment now?
Not at this time.
Okay, we will take comments later on. If you feel, Mr. Persinger, while you're going through the agenda too, if you feel you want to take public comments at any time, that's fine with me. And since you'll be chairing that part of it, it's up to you.
Okay. Well, Ashley, if you could just alert me or whoever's running the meeting that there is somebody waiting, then we'll go ahead.
Okay, sure.
And I would also say, when I'm running the meeting on my little tablet, I can only see 4 people. So if you're there waving your hand and I'm not seeing it,
I'll let you know, Gary.
Mr. Stevens will keep you up to par.
All right, that's very good. Appreciate that.
All right, Mr. Persinger, it's now your ball game.
Okay. All right. Well, what I want to do according to the agenda here is, first of all, let all of the commissioners have an opportunity to make some comments. What I'd like to do is just to hopefully briefly set the framework for what I think we need to do today. And I think as we all know, in the last 2 audit reports, the auditors have said to us that we need to have a fund balance policy for our general fund. And, with the notion behind that being that, governments really need to maintain adequate levels of fund balance to mitigate risk, unanticipated shortfalls in revenue, unanticipated increases in expenditures, unusual events that have to be accommodated in some way. So I'm sorry, I can't stop that phone. So we took a shot at doing a fund. Hold on just a second. Amy, I can't talk. I have to call you back later. Sorry.
I think extended warranty.
I have a very persistent daughter if I don't answer the phone. So in any case, we did take a shot at this last year, and the auditors took a look and said, good try, but unfortunately, it just doesn't meet the standard of good government accepted or general accepted accounting principles and also government accepted standards boards, government accounting standards board principles. So they've referred us in both audits to the Government Finance Officers Association guidelines. And they have a formal policy on the level of unrestricted fund balance that should be maintained in the general fund, according again to generally accepted accounting principles. So when you look at both the GAAP principles and the Government Accounting Standards Board's recommendations or guidelines, there are 5 types of funds that may appear in a financial statement. I've listed those on the attachment. I want to see if I can share my screen here just for a second also. I will try to do this if at all possible, and if not, I'll just talk through this. I think this is not working. Let's see. Can you see that?
It's just
No.
name. Yeah.
You can't see it?
Gary, are you bringing up the document that was on the town's website?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
Are you trying to bring the document up that was on the town website?
I was trying to share my screen that has the fund balance policy
Okay.
On it, but that's not showing up, I take it, right?
Nope.
No.
Okay, well, let's ignore that. I'll just talk through it. So we've got 5 categories of funds, and basically the ones that, just in terms of all 5 of them, there's a non-spendable category and a restricted category. And it's really the committed, the assigned, and the unassigned categories that really constitute the unrestricted fund balance, according to the guidelines from this Government Finance Officers Association. And what I included in the material that you have today is a way of looking at how those various 5 types of categories show up in our financial reports from the audit. So it's for us, I think it's also important to say that we're not talking at all about the beach tax fund. That's totally separate. We're talking only about the general fund. The beach tax fund is not part of that. So in terms of what we have in the general fund, the major categories we have are, first of all, the fund that is committed for streets and infrastructure. The table from the audit report shows the balance there of about $371,000. But we've done a fair amount of reallocation of self-committed funds over the past year. That fund now has about $650,000. And it's a little hard to tell why that's not considered a restrictive fund. It's actually in our code. We have to have a public hearing before we can spend any money from it. But at least in terms of the way our financial statements are set up, it's considered a committed fund. Then we have some assigned funds. The biggest here that's in this in the audit report is the one that's assigned for comprehensive plan. That's now down to about $20,000 or so, something like that. And again, that's because we reallocated some funds. The real big part of our general fund, I think that we'll talk most about today, is the unassigned portion. And that's really, for the most part, it's a couple of different things. It's the general fund from which we pay all of our operating expenses, but it's also an account that we have with the Brown Advisory, which is basically cash and cash equivalent investments that have accumulated from budget surpluses, and we haven't assigned any specific use for those. So there's still somewhere around $2.6, $2.7 million in that fund. I'm sorry, yeah, in that unassigned fund, the Brown Advisory portion of it, somewhere around 1.4, 1.5. So what I'd like to do is set up a few questions here that I think we need to talk about today. First of all, what part of our financial resources should we focus on? The guidelines from the Government Finance Officers Association talk about the unrestricted fund balance. And again, that's the total of the categories that are committed, that are assigned, and that are unassigned. There's also a statement in those guidelines that says that it may be appropriate to exclude from consideration resources that have been committed or assigned to some other purpose, so that it might be very reasonable for us to focus just on unassigned fund balance. Secondly, what are the factors that we need to consider? Now, those are listed in the document under determining a policy for the town, and includes predictability of revenues and volatility of expenditures, the perceived exposure to significant one-time outlays, a potential drain upon general fund resources from other funds. The next one, impact on entities' bond ratings, really isn't relevant to us, I don't think, but the notion that we might have some cost of borrowed funds. We actually talked about this as a possibility when we were talking about the potential effects of the pandemic several months ago. So that could be an issue. And then lastly, commitments and assignments that are already made for a specific purpose. So then the last question I want to pose here is, what is the impact of the factors that I just mentioned in determining the appropriate level of resources to maintain? And we also have to talk a bit about what time frame that we're talking about here as well. I included in the materials here some examples. There was an article that talked about the general fund balance discussion that took place at the Berlin, Maryland Town Council. And then there's a couple of other policies, one from town of Cary in North Carolina and one from Grandview, Missouri. And just for example, when we took a shot at this last year, we started with an initial rolling 3-month reconciled average of the operating balance for the town. But we talked about the wrong piece of the pie. We didn't talk about the real total unassigned fund balance. We only talked about that portion of it that we use, our general operating revenue that we use to pay the bills each month. If you look at the discussion in the Berlin, Maryland Town Council, they are talking about keeping an average balance for about 60 days of operation. The Cary, North Carolina talks about either 3 months or 5 months, whether you're talking about essentially the unassigned fund balance or you're talking about the overall fund balance. And if you look at the Grandview, Missouri example, they use an unassigned fund balance of 30% as their minimum threshold balance. So I'm going to stop there. And again, I want to come back to those 3 questions. What part of financial resources should we focus on? Are we talking about the overall unrestricted fund balance, or are we talking about just the unassigned fund balance? Think through all the factors that need to be considered, and then what the impact of those factors are in determining what the appropriate level of resources are to maintain.
Gary, may I? Dave Davis?
Sure, go ahead.
A couple of years ago, the Budget and Finance Committee spent some time talking through this, and we actually did make a recommendation to the council at that time that we maintain a general fund balance of 1 to 1.5 times our annual revenue. That at this day and age would be $3.7 to $5.5 million. Now that you may be talking about several different things there, because some of the things you cited in the last minute or so had to do with operating funds and maintaining a balance of operating funds for spendable money. But that's what Budget and Finance had discussed and brought to you folks a couple of years ago. And I can't speak for the members who are here on the committee, but I think we generally still would like to see that enacted at about that level.
Thank you, Dave. I actually meant to mention that. That was June 2019 that you came up with that recommendation. And I don't think we provided a lot of airtime for that particular recommendation, as I recall. But again, I'm glad that you mentioned that. So again, I'm going to stop there in terms of background. I'd like to hear, like to know if there are any other commissioners that have some comments. I'd like to hear from Mr. Stevens in particular, since he chairs, or rather, for both the investment and the Budget and Finance Committee. But again, any other commissioner, please jump in. And again, I can't see you if you want to speak. Mr. Jazinski?
David Jazinski. You're on mute, David.
Yeah, thank you. So I kind of like the way Carrie broke it out. And if I go back, I got to kind of look at the other thing. So I can't see all when I'm saying this, but they had committed, assigned, and unassigned for those three buckets in the general fund. And I guess what I kind of like to know is, are there thoughts from the investment and budget and finance around taking this large fund balance that David, you were mentioning, and kind of making breaking it apart and saying kind of what's committed and what's assigned of that? Because it sounds like the town auditors are saying that in the general, we need only at a minimum a few months of funding, which would be a minority of the general fund balance that we have today. So I'm just kind of wondering if people had given some thought to making commitments and assignments of the balances.
Just a quick thought, David, I don't think that it's an apples to apples comparison with the other towns that Gary mentioned, because they're only talking about operating funds that they may need for short term. When we considered it, and we were thinking of long term and things that would cause us to have a significant upheaval in the town operations for a long period of time. And that's why we did it based on the overall town revenue.
Okay, so you want it in one large bucket then, rather than breaking it into like the 5 buckets? Is that what you're kind of saying, how you want to do it?
We hadn't considered breaking it into the buckets. We just thought that an overall amount that was, preserved and protected, not reserved, but in a general fund balance. That's all we considered.
All right.
Okay, and anybody else have a comment? Bill? Stevens?
Thanks, Gary. I think the overall intent here was obviously for us to be able to hand the auditors the document, the fund balance policy that we're adhering to, so it's not a guessing game in terms of what the general fund balance should be. Part of this conversation came up with the investment committee, because the investment committee has long and short-term holdings based upon the investment policy that they're holding. And really what they are charged with is making sure that we are within those guidelines or guardrails. And the question is, from an investment policy perspective, is this the investment policy that matches the general fund balance policy? And then I'll bring it over to the budget and finance side that gives the town the ability, not just on the short-term operations, but on the long-term capital gains or long-term capital improvements, excuse me. So I think that's the grand scheme of bringing everyone together, is, from audit compliance, investment compliance, and budgetary from an operations perspective. I don't know, Gary, I don't think we'll, is the goal of this workshop to develop the fund balance policy and to propose it? Like, what outcome were you looking for?
Well, I'd say the outcome is a little bit uncertain, but I think we want to get the issues on the table, talk about some of these points, both in terms of, again, what pot of money are we talking about as part of our general fund balance policy, and then talk about time frame as well as talk about size. I don't think we're going to make any decisions today, but I think we need to talk about those factors and then figure out what the process needs to be from here. Who can and wants to be involved? How do we actually come up with a draft? What the timeline it should be for that draft? And I think that's about as much as that we can do during our workshop today. Any other thoughts from commissioners? If not, I will open it up to the.
Paul Bauer.
Oh,
yeah,
Mr. Bauer.
I think it'd be good time for Julia to weigh in on, from the audit perspective, what do we need to accomplish, from the, past couple of years that you've done this?
Yeah, that's a good segue into letting the auditors have some time here. Julie, go ahead.
Yeah, I think, we've had some productive phone calls with our auditors, with our current auditors, Dan Kenny being the managing partner that oversees our audit, has overseen it the last 2 years and will do so again this year in our 3rd year of our contract. But I think they realize that we're working on it. They've been, trying to give us some guidance along the way. And I know the commissioners have discussed putting, the fact that they're done working for us for free on some of this extra stuff. So, but I think they have a general sense that we are working on a plan. So I think having a plan in place from the auditor's perspective, even if it's not, obviously March 31st with the end of our fiscal year is just a few, is less than a month away since we're into March already. So I think they're realistic to know that we might not have the plan in place, but the fact that we're working towards something is they're very excited for us and are being as helpful as they possibly can. Does that make sense? Gary, do you have anything to add based on, because you were in on the calls too with?
No, I think that's a good summary.
Okay.
So if Gary, if I may make a comment, we
Sure.
have what we do have on the website, I believe, is the policy as written by former town manager Scott Koenig and presented to Dan Kinney, the audit firm.
Right.
And this, I don't know if it's you, Julie, or Gary, but you had made a comment that this was not sufficient from an audit perspective. Can you give a little bit more depth into what was missing from the policy?
Want me to address that or do you want to address that?
Go ahead, you make some comments, Julie, and I will chime in.
Okay.
I think I didn't, from our conversation, my understanding basically was that it was a good first start and we took a stab at it. It fell short of what they would like to see, but they definitely, and again, this is where kind of they're willing to work with us, but that's going to take some extra effort on their part to work with us. Gary, is that what you kind of got from our conversations?
Yeah, I think just going back to what they said in the audit report, the basic criticism was that the policy includes terminology / applications that are not aligned with governmental accounting and generally accepted accounting principles. And just for example, we talked about in our policy, we talked about the policy applying to unrestricted fund balance. Well, we really didn't do that. We were only talking about the operating revenues that we have to pay the bills from month to month. And that's really what our policy was focused on. So, we really didn't tie that policy back to the kind of financial presentation that we have in the audit report that is in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles and also with government accounting standards that are out there as well that we have to abide by. So, I mean, some of this is kind of cleaning it up, but in other cases, I think we need to, we do have a big pot of money, of unassigned money. It's about, again, $2.7 million. We know that a big portion of that is to pay the bills, but we also know that we have a big portion of the Brown Advisory. We do have to sort out this notion that Dave Davis said that we're talking about, in some sense, apples and oranges between, I think, what Budget and Finance may have recommended a year and a half ago and what we're trying to do now. I'm not sure that's the case, but I think that we certainly can develop a fund balance policy that meets the requirements of the auditors and the accepted accounting principles and standards. But I don't know if we can go to $5.5 million, for example, if that's what we need to have.
Make a comment, Gary?
Fund balance.
Gary, can I make a comment?
Sure.
How about if we start with just a general framework and say, the amount could be between 1 and 1.5 times revenue, and it will take some time to get there, and we'll set a a general time frame for achieving that based on economic conditions, and that this would be for unallocated or unrestricted funds that we're talking about, and the restricted funds are a percentage of that, and then we can start with that and haggle over that and see where it goes.
Commissioner Bauer.
Yeah, I'm reading Cone Resnick's report here. So this is on page 2. So they described what exactly we need to do here, right? So we weren't aligned with governmental accounting and GAAP principles. And we just need to establish whatever the policy is. We can come up with whatever numbers later, but maybe Bill, can you help us? What specifically are they looking for here that we are supposed to have in place by March 31st?
Well, who's that directed to? Is that Bill Stevens?
Bill
or-
Stevens.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Bill,
I
do you-
can.
I don't know what the governmental accounting and GAAP principles are that we're supposed to be observing, but I mean, it sounds like it's something that's pretty well defined.
Well, I mean, it is, and that's much of that is in the background document that was part of the supporting materials for the meeting today. I mean, there is a set of guidelines that this Government Finance Officers Association has available. There's a copy of that there. And again, our financial statements that we put together every year for the audit report do meet all of these accounting principles.
Right.
And so that's not a problem. The problem is we need to come up with a fund balance policy that uses all of the right terminology, calls these funds by the appropriate names, and then make some decisions again about the level of finances that we're really talking about. Do we want to talk just about the unassigned category where we're talking about amounts that have not been designated for a particular spending purpose, or should it be broader than that? I mean, my own feeling is that I think that we have so few other types of funds, and we have one big committed account, which is the streets and infrastructure account, that our time would be best spent just talking about that unassigned category, which again is mostly two things: the general operating revenues and the Brown advisory account. I think we also have to struggle with this notion of whether or not it makes sense for something to say that we need to have a year or more of funds available in this fund balance to protect us against, to manage risk in the future.
Yes. So my take is, on a target that we need to be careful not to make a policy that's a lot greater than what we have now, and then we'd be in a violation of our policies. So, I think what we want to do is we want to basically set an allocation of this general fund balance to those buckets as our outline. And it sounds like there are 3. As I go back to the document, it sounds like you can do committed, assigned, and unassigned, and then have a policy going forward about how we maintain funding in those 3 buckets, where surpluses go and things like that. I'm kind of concerned because we don't presently have 1.5 times the town's revenues. And I'm just wondering if it would be kind of bad form to put a policy that we're in violation of day one, so to speak.
But it's not a policy you're in violation of, David. It's something that we aspire to, and it will take some time to reach it.
Okay, I thought we were doing our balance policy today. Maybe I'm not.
Well, we are, I think, but I think that this is a fundamental question in terms of what our fund balance policy should be.
Right.
Are we talking about what time frame are we talking about having funds available for? Is it the basic bare minimum of 2 months that's in the GFOA guidelines, or is it 3, or is it a year and a half, as Budget and Finance Committee has suggested? I think that's a key question that we need to struggle with.
Right.
Gary Dale Cook here.
Yeah, go
I
ahead.
just want to throw in a few words here and say that I agree with Dave Davis that on the recommendation that the Budget and Finance Committee made probably 2 years ago now, right, Dave?
Yes.
June
Yeah,
2018.
and I personally think that the goal ought to be to have a year's worth of, for lack of a better term, money set aside, and that our policy would head in that direction.
Kind of
That's all.
solves the problem.
Any other thoughts about that?
From what I have heard, if I could speak in here as I'm listening to all of this, and I'm not a financial person, but Gary, you have more than any of the others defined what the problem is, that we don't have a stated policy. And that's the most critical part of any of this, is defining the problem. There are symptoms all over the place and everything, but your thing of we don't have a policy to do this and this and the other sounds to me the most articulate definition of what the problem is.
Other comments? And I think we've heard from the investment committee. I know, Brian, did you have some thoughts?
Sure. So I sort of come at this from what I would say is the end point, which is, what do we do with the money now that we know where it's to be allocated? So the investment committee's mandate, as far as I'm concerned, is to simply oversee Brown Advisory and make sure that they're investing within the guidelines that we set for them. The problem for us in doing that is we don't know what the money is intended to be used for. And so sort of working in reverse, getting back to first principles, the investment committee needs to know where the dollars are supposed to be spent. And I think that at the end of the day is, I'm hearing a lot about the government principles and conformity to GAAP, but it doesn't sound to me like we've even settled on the most basics of, when a dollar comes in, how many cents get spent on operations, how many cents are committed to A, B, and C or are restricted, and now what's left over is unrestricted. How much of that is committed into bucket A, how much is committed into bucket B, and how much of it is completely unrestricted and has no restrictions at all. Once the investment committee has that information and it's set forth in a policy, we can guide Brown Advisory in terms of how to go about investing those dollars. Some of it is long-term, some of it is short-term. Short-term is going to have much less risk because you're trying to maintain principal. Long-term, you can take a little bit more risk on the investments and try to accumulate returns on top of principal. But it's very easy for me to talk about how to invest money, but I need to know what you want to do with it. It's really no different from, if a family came to me and said, I've got a pile of money, help me invest it. I'd say, well, what are your financial goals? Are you looking to save for college? Are you looking to buy a house? Are you looking to save for retirement? And to me, the town hasn't really settled kind of this very basic financial plan, which I think and I hope is the result of this workshop. But we need to have some guidance on what do you want to do with the money? At the end of the day, these are pretty basic principles to me. I'm hearing that Dave suggested we want 1.5 times the budget held in this unrestricted account. For what purpose? I mean, that's just a number to me. 1.5 times of what, and to be used for what? Operating accounts are short term. So how much do we need to spend on operations in any given year? That to me is a fairly fixed number. You can estimate it based on a rolling average of, say, the last 3 years. Once we know how much the operating budget is, that's money that has to be spent every year. Then the council can decide how much do we want to hold in reserve for a rainy day to make sure that we will be able to continue paying our operating expenses. So if I know I have to spend $1 million on something and I want a 3-month reserve, that means I need a 25% reserve committed to that.
Brian, I don't think that's what we're trying to accomplish today, although I understand your point. I think what we're trying to accomplish is a policy that outlines what our fund balance should be and how it should be designated. Everything you said is true, but the simple answer to your question is infrastructure and long-term remediation of sea level rise are the two, or a catastrophic event are the things that we're saving to protect against, manage risk against.
Here, here.
Well, we're also managing against risks like pandemics coming up the road and not being able to pay operating expenses. But
Correct.
to me, that's still not like, that's a great statement that we're saving to protect against sea level rise, but to spend on what? I mean, how much money does actually need to be spent on town infrastructure and operating expenses?
I
If you
think,
don't know the answers to those, you can't say how much you need to save.
but you're not going to get that in this meeting. You need to accomplish something here, right?
Well, I mean, maybe this isn't the right forum for it, but I'm still struggling with, you know, you want to preserve X percent of the budget for some future purpose. I mean, those are just all unknowable variables right now, at least in this conversation. I mean, I don't know what the budget is for the future, so I can't tell you how much you need to save. I mean, telling me I need to save 1.5 times of X and I don't know what X is not really a meaningful discussion.
So Gary, kind of
Yeah. Go ahead.
going back to your supplementary documents in the case of Cary, North Carolina, they had, you know, non-spendable and restricted, and we know those are, and our restricted is our beach fund. And then they had committed, assigned, and unassigned as the 3 buckets. And they're saying that those align with the accounting principles. So I guess my question to, I guess, the audit committee, who kind of knows the accounting standards, is if we align ourselves of having, rather than just a general fund, is having what's our general fund right now split into items 3, 4, and 5, which is committed, assigned, and unassigned, would that meet the needs of what the auditors are asking for?
Julie or anybody want to take a shot at that? I will comment as well. You're on mute, Julie.
Sorry, I caught the end of that. I was looking at a work email. Sorry.
Okay. I'll ask you again, Julie, just so I.
Sorry, David.
It's not a problem. Like, everyone's got to multitask. I get it. In the backup documents that Gary Persinger provided, there is a sample from Cary, North Carolina, where they're saying that their definitions of how they break apart their reserve funds aligns with accounting principles. And they have non-spendable, restricted, and then committed, assigned, and unassigned. And I believe the way we're doing it today, our general fund kind of aligns to 3, 4, and 5, committed, assigned, and unassigned, with the exception of infrastructure. I guess infrastructure is our committed fund.
Right.
But so my question is, if the auditors are saying that we need to get a policy put in place, if we define 5 buckets similar to what Cary, North Carolina did, and put some words around what committed and assigned for, committed is like infrastructure, we could make other committed funds as well. Would that meet the need of what the auditors are saying to do? And do we have to have a target number for each of those, or can that kind of be figured out as we go forward?
I think based on our previous conversations, I think that would meet their needs. Gary, correct me if you think I'm wrong. But, and again, I don't know if do the numbers have to be specifically in place? I guess I'm still unclear about that. Is if, you know, this is a policy that we're gonna, you know, try to, I guess I look at it like, you know, in a perfect world, this is what we want, and this is what we want to be our goal. But do those numbers have to be right on track this year for us to be, in their eyes, meet their standards? I'm not so sure. Gary, what are your thoughts on that?
What we're talking about, we already have our financial resources placed into those 5 categories of funds.
Right.
And you can see that in the table in the audit report. And we're not talking about reserve funds. And Cary, North Carolina is not talking about reserve funds. They're talking about everything that's in their general fund. That's where you pay the bills from. That's where your budget surpluses go. That's where you have funds that are committed for specific purposes or that are assigned for specific purposes. And there's a difference in the assigned and committed category. It depends on whether or not you actually have an ordinance that supports the commitment of funds, or the town council has just made a decision that they want to assign funds for a particular purpose. So again, we're talking about all the general funds.
Right.
The only thing that's excluded from our consideration here is the beach tax fund. That's a totally separate fund. Its use is very restricted. It was established with a public referendum. And so we're not talking about that. We're just talking about that general fund, which is essentially all of the resources that we have to operate the town. So the question is, do we need to have a total general fund if you look across all 5 categories of funds? And I think that would probably be inconsistent with what we're seeing in the guidelines, because the guidelines say that you should have a policy on what the minimum balance should be for your unrestricted fund balance, which is just the last 3 categories: committed, assigned, and unassigned. I would contend that the money for streets and infrastructure is already, in essence, well tied up. It has a separate funding stream. We get 20% of building permits that goes in there. We get 5% of transfer taxes, I believe now, that's going in there. And I think there's something from, there may be 5% of parking permits that go in there as well. So that's got its own funding stream. I don't think we need to be talking about that. The other assigned categories that we have are so small at this point. One is just a residual category. The legal and litigation fund is really just a residual category. We haven't put any money into that fund for 5-6 years, as far as I can recall.
Right.
But there was a much bigger balance, and we simply spent most of that money. The big pot of money we're really talking about is that unassigned pot of money, and that's in the neighborhood of 2.6, 2.7. And then the question is, how big should that pot be? If we go look at it any given month, we would probably want to calculate some sort of an average over time. Should that be, should that be $3.7 million, which is our current budget? Should we have that much money in that unassigned fund balance so that if we have to manage some sort of risk that we face, that we have an unanticipated calamity in town, we have a hurricane that hits the town. Do we need that much money to manage the town and to bring it back up to the level that we think will have it operating efficiently again? Or do we need something less than that? We thought we were going to be in that situation with the pandemic this year. The first predictions that we had were pretty dire. And then we were saved by unanticipated hot real estate market. We actually got double what we expected in transfer taxes this year. We expected about 600,000. We've got 1.2 million. So that's good, clearly, for the budget. It was also good for our streets and infrastructure account. That meant we put about $60,000 in there just from transfer taxes.
Folks, I'm going to sign off in a couple of minutes. I apologize.
Okay.
I've said my piece. I think we should go for 1 to 1.5 times revenue for the unassigned and give ourselves enough time to reach that level and then write it up in a policy. And I think it's as simple as that in my view. So
I agree with that 100%.
Before you go, just one comment about that. If we were going to do something like that, you have to have a mechanism for growing that. Otherwise, you're just depending on the possibility that you're going to have budget surpluses. You also have to have some way of planning for capital improvements. We have absolutely no capital improvement budget. Where's that money going to come from?
I don't think that's part of a policy.
Well, it could be part of the process of developing that policy and coming to a decision about what the appropriate level of resources we should have available in terms of our general fund, unassigned general fund balance.
But there are 12 very smart people on this call, and all we have accomplished so far is to outline a problem. All I'm trying to say is here's what I would do to solve the problem. And that's all I have to say. You guys can talk about all the rest of it. I've said my piece.
Okay, thank you, Dave.
Take care.
Bill, do you have a
Thanks, Dave.
comment, Stevens?
Yeah, I see 3 different issues that have come out of things that we need to address. One is the long-range plan. Long-range plan for the town. We had a meeting and town manager was talking about the need for new town hall, potentially renovations, police department. So we need to have a long-range plan that's over the next 5, 7, 10 years, whatever that might be, so that we can see the use of funds. To Brian Priver's point, I don't know where Brian, there you are, Brian. Like where am I gonna need these funds? What does it really mean? That's the first thing. What I'm hearing you say in terms of the general fund balance, what do we need to keep in our bank account? What do we need to keep in our checking account? What's at risk from time to time? And, I personally look at it as the summer, right? So if I ask Sheena, how much cash do we have to spend from May 15th to September 15th? In my mind, having that in the bank account allows it, at least we know that we're going to get through our toughest point, which is during the summer season. Gary, the third thing is I think we need to look at what we have defined in the committed and assigned and make sure that it matches that LRP, the long range plan. So the money that is being assigned for streets and infrastructure, so I think there needs to be a leveling on that also.
Commissioner Jasinski.
I don't really have a problem with us having general reserves of or a target of general reserves of getting to 1.5 times. But to your point, Gary, if we're going to do that, then we have to start actually budgeting in advance to be adding to our current balance, which would be significant in terms of our pressure, because typically the way our general fund grows is kind of by accident, where we have a transfer tax year like this year, right? And that we get surplus revenue rather than budgeting for it in advance in a significant way. But the other thing I'd say is if we're going to have a $5 million target to have kind of money in the bank, I think in terms of the committed and assigned, we really need to, from a policy perspective, assign targets towards infrastructure type spending such as sewers, where there's large spending coming up, and spending such as that'll be needed to renovate town hall and potentially build a new municipal building, because those are the types of things that are really going to cost a lot of money, where we're going to have to tap our town reserves, and to just kind of have it out there as a $5 million line item without saying why we have $5 million. I just worry about that.
Well, any other comments? I had one comment, but I want to let everybody have a chance here. Yeah, I think in terms of thinking about having a year of reserves, what if we are faced with an unexpected catastrophe? Let's say a hurricane comes in and wipes the town out. How much money do we need at that point to run the town? I mean, there are lots of very negative things that are going to happen as a result of that. We're going to be cutting staff. We're going to have a lot of trouble, and I'm just not sure that having a year of revenue is the thing that we're going to need at that point. I mean, there are going to have to be a number of hard decisions that you would have to make if you're faced with a catastrophe like that. I'm not ruling it out if that's the combined wisdom of the group. If that's what they think we need to have, then we have to have a plan, as you suggested, Dave, to build toward that. And that I think is going to be very difficult. I mean, you've really got to find some resources, and then you got to find a way to address some of those other things. If, on the other hand, you take a different approach and you focus, as Bill Stevens suggested, on just the summer season, and you say that's really what we need to have as a continuing rolling fund balance throughout the year, then we're going to have some additional revenues that we could then devote to some of these other needs. Streets and infrastructure. We could begin to build a capital improvement fund. We can begin to talk about how you would be able to build a new town hall and be able to finance that. I'm not sure that we can build a year's worth of reserves and solve and actually be able to serve those other needs as well, without some really large change in our revenue picture, our ability to generate revenue in Dewey Beach.
Mr. Kinley's got his hand up.
Go ahead, Joe.
Thank you. Gary, in any of the other examples that you reviewed, is there any chance that, should there be a black swan event occur, that the town of Dewey Beach could seek out now or near future a catastrophic umbrella policy, insurance policy?
I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if the town manager has any thoughts about that after his vast experience here as town manager.
Commissioner Persinger, I don't at this point. I don't think that's a bad idea. I could make some phone calls and ask, but as of right now, sir, nothing.
Okay. Anyone else have a
Gary?
view on that? I don't know.
Yeah, I would have to think that there's many other beach towns that have had this black swan catastrophic event. And I wouldn't be a bit surprised if some of the New Jersey shore towns have sought out some kind of umbrella catastrophic policy. So, Bill, if you like, I'd be happy to help you with that.
Okay. Any other thoughts anyone wants to share here?
Yeah, this is Bernie.
Go ahead, Bernie.
One of the things we've tossed around some catastrophic events, but have anybody done the analysis to see what we really need if an event hits? What's the minimum structure? What do we have to be, continuity of operations? Do we have any of that in place now?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, we've only talked about the issue, and we've talked a little bit around the edges about, what kinds of compromises or changes would you have to make if you're really faced with some sort of a catastrophe, some sort of catastrophic loss of revenue or increase in expenditures.
It might be good for another type of meeting, just to have an open discussion of those items to identify what it is, so you can actually plan for this budget and how much you're going to need.
Yeah, there's actually, if you dig into some of the materials available from the Government Finance Officers Association, they actually have an exercise that you can go through. It's a spreadsheet based thing, and you can begin to rate the various risks that you might face. And then that would help you, that would feed into your determination of the time period that you would need to cover if in fact you're faced with some sort of unusual risk or catastrophic event. We've never tried to do that in any sort of organized way. I mean, we can continue to talk about that sort of thing, or we can begin to make a decision and take a first cut at this, and come up with a policy that really does meet the guidelines that are set forth by the auditors, so that we get over that hump. But perhaps come up with a document that we believe is a living document that should be subject to revisiting it and revision. But again, even to do that, we need to make some basic decisions about the kind of time period that we're focused on in terms of how much revenue we should have available as a sustaining force if we're faced with some sort of event like that.
So let me make a suggestion here.
Okay.
Why don't we, from a policy perspective, say that to Commissioner Stevens' idea, we come up with a number that is our summer spending that we need to do. And that is the minimum amount that is in the unassigned fund balance. And then we take the rest of what's now our general fund balance, put that in the assigned category, and split it into two assigned pieces, which we have flexibility on. One piece will be the kind of infrastructure around streets, sewers, that type of stuff. And the other will be a long-term building fund. Does that sound reasonable to folks?
Any thoughts? I mean, from my perspective, it sounds like a regional approach. It's very similar to what I was thinking before the phone call today. But I really would like to hear from some other folks here in terms of what their thoughts are. Anyone?
Brian?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just sort of echo what Commissioners Jasinski and Stevens have said, that I think it's a little bit arbitrary in my view to start from the end point, which is we want 1 or 1.5 times revenue. You have to start with the budget first. So start with what is the operating budget each year, agree on some percentage of that as needed in reserves, be it 3 months worth, 6 months worth, a year's worth, And then there are long-range planning projects, and it doesn't seem like we've gotten to any resolution as to what those long-range projects are going to cost. I mean, I think everybody agrees there is going to be a need to upgrade the basic infrastructure of the town, but how much is that going to cost? So if we know the long-range plan, or the LRP to use Bill's term, that helps quite a bit in determining how much you need to throw into the reserve fund, and you can assign it accordingly. And I think to Commissioner Jasinski's point, it's flexible. It's not set in stone, but you can at least begin to budget around that. And now you at least know if we have to put X dollars toward sewers and Y dollars towards building a new town hall, and we know the operating budget is Z, X plus Y plus Z tells you how much you need in that fund. And I think it's a fairly straightforward equation, but we're missing all the variables. We know what the variables are, we just don't know what the amounts are. And you can't budget without knowing what those amounts are. It's kind of like planning for college. If you know you're going to send your kid to college in 18 years, you can project how much that's going to cost and you budget accordingly. And this, to me, is the same exercise, just with, we're not talking about college, we're talking about town infrastructure.
Right, right. Any other comments?
Gary, Mr. Prever just said he agreed with Mr. Stevens and Mr. Jasinski, but he talked about deciding what percentage of the operating budget we need to have in reserve, and we haven't even come anywhere close to deciding that.
Well, that's true. I think that's still a difficult question that we still have to struggle with that. I think, one possibility is to put together something that provides some options. Let's say if we were to decide that we needed 3 months of revenue as a reserve, that would free up X number of dollars that could be put toward streets and infrastructure, and Y amount of dollars that could go to capital improvements, building a new town hall, et cetera. If in fact we needed 6 months, or if we needed a full year, we could put together some scenarios and kind of think through what the implications are of those scenarios. Clearly, if we're talking about something on the order of a year of revenues in reserve, we have to not only find ways to fund streets and infrastructure and capital improvement, but we also have to find a way of building up that reserve fund. Anything less than that, if we're anything less than the 2.6 or $2.7 million being held in reserve, then we've actually freed up some money that we could put into those other couple of categories. So I don't know, maybe that's one way. We could certainly do something like that. Maybe that's one way of framing the question so that we can begin to think through what the implications are of each of those scenarios. Our budget and finance committee chair has a very strongly held opinion that we need to have a year to a year and a half. I don't know how strongly that's held by other people. I don't know if the audit committee, for example, has a strong feeling about the time period we should be talking about and settling on. It sounds like there isn't a decision or a firmly held opinion on the investment side at this point. It's still an open question. It's fundamental. We have to solve that. We have to answer that question, or we can't really move forward on this.
Well, Gary, if I understand you're saying it's fundamental to answer the question of the percentage of the budget as set aside for a safety factor for carry on town operations in case of some catastrophe. But I hear it's such a varied amount that even though I supported the Budget and Finance Committee on a year's worth of funds, if it's shown to me that it's illogical, then I of course would change my thoughts on that. But I haven't heard one way or the other. I haven't heard a logic behind either one. whether it be 3 months or 6 months or a year.
Well, I mean, I think the logic on the lower end is basically that's consistent with GFOA guidelines. And there is some discussion in there that, you know, depending on the risk that you think you face, you may want to vary that a little bit. But there doesn't seem to be any implication in the guidelines that, you know, rather than sticking with 2 months, which is the minimum time period that GFOA recommends, that you would go all the way to a year of operating revenues or a year and a half. And I haven't seen that in any of the examples that I have looked at. That's not to say that we might not make a decision that our circumstances in Dewey Beach are so unique that we believe that we have to go there. But I think we do have to think through the implications of that decision. If we decide it's a year of revenue, we're basically $1 million short on that policy. We'd have to find a way to get another $1 million so that we could build that reserve up, as well as address those other priorities. So I mean, we got to answer those questions, or it's going to be very difficult for us to move forward.
Gotcha.
Any other thoughts?
Unmute. There we go. Sorry. Just, you know, if when people want to have, or a government organization wants to have more money than they presently have, it's important to be able to tell the public why. And I don't know that that having total reserves outside the beach fund of a year to year and a half is necessarily a bad thing, but I think some mix of that is actually for town hall and things like fixing the sewers that are really in bad shape on a lot of our streets. So I think as part of this, and why I kind of liked what Bill outlined, is I think the operational reserves to kind of run the town are only a small part of that. The lion's share of this big balance we need to have is for the things that just cost huge amounts of money, like renovating or building a town hall or fixing all these sewers, which the survey has showed have very, very significant problems that need to be fixed in the next few years.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I guess what I'm coming to here is maybe thinking through pulling together some sort of a presentation that outlines the options. You know, these are the various ranges that we might consider in terms of a unassigned fund balance. And this would be a fundamental part of our general fund balance policy. Then we might have, and here's one that we think makes a lot of sense from a couple of perspectives. You know, it's perfectly consistent to decide that the circumstances in Dewey Beach are such that our summer season is essential to us. So we have to have enough revenue available on a continuing month-to-month basis that we could actually be sustainable through the summer season based on that reserve fund. So we're talking about, you know, 4 to 5 months of operating revenue as a reserve. That's very consistent with the GFOA guidelines. You know, the minimum is 2, but, you know, our circumstances are so unique, we believe we need 4 or 5. You know, then we could talk about what the implications are of that. All right, so if we're maintaining 4 or 5 months as our general fund balance policy, that would free up then X number of dollars for other things. We could then devote more money to streets and infrastructure, for which we already have an account, but we could also provide the seed money for a capital improvement budget that we also critically need, because there's some things that need to be addressed there as well. Perhaps even as expensive or close to as expensive as the streets and infrastructure problems that have to be addressed. So it's kind of it presents the options. It allows people to talk more about those options, but it also would present a reasonable option that we could all consider and talk about as a specific example of what our fund balance policy might be. Does that make any sense perhaps as a way to proceed?
To me, it does.
Yep.
Can I ask one question? Sheena, do you have the monthly budget available to know what the summer budget expenditures are going to be?
Not off the top of my
Okay.
head.
That's fair.
I've been taking notes to get that for you tomorrow morning.
Okay.
You want to think verbally, Bill, as opposed to?
Yeah. You know what it is. Sorry about that. Yeah, my exercise in my head was when I look at our fiscal 2020 budget, and I went through your mindset of a hurricane comes through, levels this town. We still need police. We still need building inspector. We still need administration. We're probably not going to, there's a period of time that we're going to, a year and that one that to rebuild. So if I back out things like aldermen, beach patrol, seasonal employees, I go from 3.7 to 2.5 million. Okay, just think that having that core of what we need to run this town, if it takes a year for us to get back to where we were, I would imagine that when Sheena looks at the budget, it's probably going to be for those 4 months somewhere around $1 million. I don't know. I don't know off the top. Maybe it's 1.4 because I don't remember. And Gary, you thinking that maybe it is that it's a minimum of 1.4, maximum of 2? Like, are we going to go with that type of a guideline? And here's the reason why. Because it's 4 months of the summer, May 15th through September 15th. Also at the high end, what our budget would need to be for a year to keep the basic services running, assuming that we don't have transfer tax, we don't have accommodation tax or accommodation fees, we don't have parking, et cetera. So is that what you were thinking?
Well, I hadn't taken it quite that far. I mean, I was just thinking about coming up with, first of all, the 3 or 4 different scenarios, and then what a reasonable policy might be if we assume that we needed to have enough as an unassigned fund balance to support the town for the summer season. That was really as far as you're really taking another step further and thinking through a little more carefully about what sort of money would we need and where could we cut in order to keep the town running. It's kind of another way of, I guess, getting to what a reasonable policy might be. So the more you can clarify or make that more specific, I think that could be helpful to build in here. I don't know, other thoughts?
Brian?
Yeah, just one quick observation. I mean, we've been talking about it in terms of months, but I think to Bill's point about the summer season being the most critical, I wouldn't reduce it to just say the 4 months unless you know what the 4 months equate to out of the total year, because it's obviously not equally spread out over 12 months throughout the year.
Right.
So I wouldn't just take a 35%. 4 months is roughly 35%. Those are the 4 biggest months by far. So that might actually turn out to be 80%.
Right.
Whatever
Right.
the breakdown is.
Yeah, I think we would want to look at actual revenues that are generated during those summer months, as well as expenditures that are made during those summer months, and then make a decision about what the most appropriate target is, whether it's revenues or expenditures. But it would apply specifically to the summer season. So I'm not sure that we can do a lot more today other than, as I say, come to some agreement that we'll put together some scenarios, put together what we think might be a possible reasonable policy that we might suggest, at least to have one for consideration and further discussion, and spend some more time on thinking through what we would actually do with a reserve fund at various levels. Again, if we were to go fully to a year of the budget, is there a way to think through the necessity for that level? What would you actually need to spend that money for in order to sustain the town in the event of some sort of catastrophic event? I'm a little lost here in the wilderness in terms of about how to best approach this, but that's kind of the best I can come up with at this point. And I'd be happy to generate a draft and circulate it to other people for comment. And I think we can do that as long as comments were coming back just to one single individual. We could probably send it out to the entire group. I believe that is correct, Mayor, as long as we get any feedback, any comments coming back to a single individual.
That's correct.
Okay. Does that work for everyone?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay. In terms of a time frame, I'm not sure that I can do something like that before sometime early next month. We're not going to have something in place for the auditors this year. I think the best we're going to be able to do is to show them that we're really making a very good, honest effort. And I think, with Mr. Zolper's agreement, and I think Julie, you would be comfortable with this too. We can certainly go back to the auditors. That we reached out to them and asked them for some guidance on this, and they were very glad that we did so. They were very happy. They welcomed that. As Julie said, they do want to get paid, which is certainly not unreasonable. But I think as we develop this thing, I think it would be a good idea to reach back out to the auditors and get some feedback from them in terms of what scenarios really make sense. Do they know some examples where towns have actually gone to having a fund balance on a continuing basis that is as much as a year's worth of revenue or expenditures for the town? I think that kind of information could be very, very useful. They may be even to be able to give us some explanations, some arguments, some justifications for why we should go in one direction or the other. So I think they could be a valuable resource. We might have to spend a little money to do that, but I think it could be money well spent.
I would agree with you, Gary. I think they're enthusiastic to help us. They are excited that we are reaching out to them for their help. So I think it'd be ridiculous not to use them as a resource, because, and I know in other capacities that they're willing to be a resource. So we just need to use them.
Okay, I agree.
I agree.
So do I. And Gary, I would guess that Mr. Stevens would be willing to donate part of his salary as commissioner to cover any cost.
Yeah, I'll donate mine as well.
At least 4 months worth.
Yeah.
All right. Any other thoughts from any of the committee members, any of the commissioners? I think we've made some progress. This is a difficult issue to address, but I think we have moved forward. So I'm going to turn it back to the mayor at this point, if there are no other comments, and we can finish out our agenda.
Actually, do we have anybody on the line for public comments?
No, no one's waiting.
Well, Mr. Persinger, then what our next town meeting, other than May the 12th, after that is April the 9th. Would you consider April 9th or May 14th, which would be the following town meeting, give you some time, you might, or give us all some time to put this together?
Yeah, I think this is probably going to run to May. I can probably get a draft of something together by early in April. So I don't think this is going to be ready for any kind of discussion in April at the April meeting. But by May, I think we should be able to do something.
Would you like to talk about having another meeting?
Yeah, I think that might be a good idea. Once we actually have something on paper that people can react to, they can send some comments, we can make some revisions, and then have a meeting on that. That would be a possible strategy, I think.
So we're talking possibly sometime in the middle of May. Maybe before that. I don't know. I don't have clearly in my mind how difficult this is going to be. Gotcha.
I really don't.
And then we would hold off on deciding on another meeting at this time and figure it out. Might be before the middle of May. The May 14th is the second Friday of May. That's when we have our town commissioners meeting. If we continue on with the Zoom meetings, it'll be that way.
Yeah.
And
I would certainly invite anyone who wants to provide some input after this meeting today, and would welcome any additional thoughts or advice that you might have. Certainly could be very helpful in putting this together.
Unless there's no other comments, we'll talk about everybody responding to Mr. Persinger when he sends something out, and to this meeting, respond to him with any thoughts or comments. because we have to be very attentive to the FOIA issues. We're down then to town manager's comments, and I believe the town manager does have some comments.
So thanks, Mr. Mayor. So, most of our expenses are in the summer, most of our income's in the summer. So I think as Bill has said, we need to make sure that we're covering that as we move forward with having money set aside. There are some things that'll be coming up in this 2022 budget. Like the hotel tax is going to help, but then there's some other things that we're going to have to pay for. And there needs to be, and I've said this before, from my department heads, what I need to purchase 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the road so we can continue to buy them the equipment they need to service the people of Dewey Beach. And that includes a 5-year plan to have a new town hall / police station or revamped one at some point. One of the things we don't have here that other towns do, if they have a storm and it comes through and wipes them out, they still seem to get a property tax to get some money in. We do not have that. Again, all our revenue comes in from people coming here to visit and doing things in the town. So I'm always keeping that in mind as I look at our money and what we're trying to do with it. I will reach out to Dan Keeney tomorrow and talk to him about the fund balance for 1 year worth of revenue and what we should have compared to other towns. Pending any questions, that's all I have, Mr. Mayor.
Any other comments for the group that anybody would like to make? Then hearing none, is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
So moved. Is there a